Hello, my name is Russ Maxwell, and this is my first DevOps video where I'm going to talk about how to build and deploy a Python web application to Azure. So we're going to use a combination of different components. We're going to use VS Code, we're going to use Git, we're going to leverage a repository in GitHub. We're also going to leverage Azure, as well as Azure DevOps. Feel free to subscribe to my channel as I will be publishing additional sessions around DevOps in the near future. Let's get started. So the general idea behind this video is to talk, of course, about each of those components I just mentioned, but also show you a flow of how these different technologies work together in order to produce a solution within Azure. And so as we move along in this video series, as I create additional videos, this high-level flow will kind of get you familiar with some of the deeper level conversations that I intend to have in future videos. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to grab code from a repository on GitHub that represents a Python web application. We're going to make a change to that locally. And then we're going to push that code up to a new repository in Azure DevOps. And then finally, within Azure DevOps, we're going to build a pipeline to build that code into a web app and then deploy to Azure. So pretty cool stuff to see how all this works together. And the best part is this is pretty much all going to be demo based, and I will include a references slide at the end, but let's get started. So the very first thing I want to kind of mention is your local machine is in this case a fairly important part of this particular scenario, because in a version control, a distributed version control environment, what's happening is your development team, they're actually doing most of their coding locally on their local machine. And they're pushing those changes back up to whatever repository that they're designating, whether it be GitHub or Azure repositories or some other repository out there. Because my Azure repository is Git-based, that basically means that I'm using distributed version control. And so because of that, I need my local machine set up with Git, with VS Code, and optionally, if I'm doing any Python development, I'm going to want to download and install Python. And then, of course, within VS Code, if I'm going to be working with Python, I probably want the extension installed. And so these are the different links to download and install those for Windows 10 machine. And most of these are cross-platform, so you should be able to find the download links for different platforms if you'd like. So I'm in VS Code, and I want to show you that I do have Git for Windows installed. And in order to do this validation, I simply launched Bash in a terminal shell, and Bash is included when you download and install Git for Windows. So I'm just going to run Git, and you can see I have results back. So it's all set there. So I think I'm ready to roll. What I need to do next is to choose a repository on GitHub that I'm interested in. And in this case, this is my own repository. And this is a sample Python web application, very, very basic. And what I need to do is I need to clone this repository, which is a fancy way of saying I need to basically copy it down locally. And so what I need to do is hit the pull down for code, and I need to copy this URL, which will be used by Git to retrieve this. So that's copied. I'm going to come back here to VS Code. Notice the folder you're in is important. So right now I'm in D projects. And because I'm running it from D projects, this is where the repo, by default, this is where it's going to be stored, this repository. So I'm simply going to run git clone. All right. So good news, it is present. If I go to my D projects folder, I have the repository now there, and it does look like it's initialized with Git because I have the .git folder present. So good news. All right, next up, I'm going to open the folder. So in VS Code, I'm going to open the folder. I'm going to select projects and my repository I just cloned. All right, great. Let's open up a new terminal session. There we go. And one way to know this is initiated as a Git repository, so I can do git status. And you can see I'm on main branch. And so that's how commits are stored. They're stored in branches. And you always start with what's called the main branch. It used to be called trunk. But in this case, I'm in the main branch locally. And because I'm receiving that message and not a fatal error, I know that it is successfully initiated as a Git repository. Okay, so step one is completed. So I've cloned a repository from GitHub locally, and now I need to set up things on the Azure side. So I need to set up an Azure web application. And then after that's set up, I need to go into Azure DevOps and set up my project, which comes with a repository. And so I'm in Azure currently, my Azure portal, and I'm in my resource group, and I'll click add and choose Azure web app. It looks like the web app's here. Okay, I like the RG it's in. I'm gonna call this RustMax 7. It will be published with code. And of course for this, I'm gonna select, in this case, I'm selecting Python 3.7. And I'll select the same region as the resource group. Actually, I just want to do dev test, so I'm going to go with the free plan. All right, so it's creating. All right, it's completed. Let's take a look. So good news, it is running. I do have a URL, which you're always going to get a URL by default of whatever name you entered for the web app plus azurewebsites.net. So I'm going to click on that and make sure I've got a good response here. All right, so this is the sample site. There's some good stuff here in terms of quick start and kind of getting things prepared and getting your feet wet with Python, but this is fantastic. So now have a Python-based web application spun up that we're going to end up deploying to in Azure. And now I'm in the Azure DevOps portal, so dev.azure.com. I'm in my organization, and I've already spun up a few projects. The one I'm interested for this particular project is here, RustMax demo. So I'm going to click on it. And you can see on the left, I've got a bunch of information. So each project you create comes with an overview, boards, repos, pipelines, test plans, and artifacts. For this session, I'm interested mainly in showing you repos and some information about pipelines. And so the cool thing here is that if I click on repos, it's not initialized yet, but I do have a default repo that's available to me. If you don't want to use the default, you can always come up here and create your own repo. In my case, I'm perfectly okay with using the project-based repo. And again, this is going to store my source code. And so what I want to do here is I need to push my code to it from VS Code. And let's go ahead and do that now. Let's make a change in VS Code to my Python web application code. And then I'm going to push that package up to this repository. All right, so I'm back in VS Code on my local client. I've got the project opened and I'm going to make a change. And notice at the top of this Python file, I don't expect you to be well versed in Python. I'm taking that approach here. If you are, then this should be pretty basic, but I had the Flask framework. I'm using the Flask web framework, and it is a Python web framework, and it's small but robust. So I'm going to utilize it, and so I had to install it. So I did a pip install Flask. So very similar to something like this to get it installed. And after I installed it, I was able to reference it from line 1 here, create the object, and then have just just a easy response when I hit the page. And so I want to change this, right? Because this is the code that was pulled from GitHub, and I want to change that to this code was updated locally and pushed to Azure DevOps repo. Okay. Because that's what we're doing. We've already cloned this, right? So we want to make a change to it, and that's what we're doing. We're making a change to the code. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And you do have some source control directly within VS Code if you'd like to use that. I'm not going to discuss that. I'm just going to show you through just the command line using Git on how to take these changes and get them committed and merged into the local main branch. So if I were to run git status, that shows you where things at, and you can see I've made it. Actually, I removed the a pipeline YAML file. I'll talk about that in a moment. I removed, and then I changed a couple files. So again, this is not really geared towards ramping you up from a Python perspective. It's just kind of showing you how things flow together from more of an infrastructure standpoint. So cool. So I do have some changes, and the first step is I need to push those changes into what's called staging. And so in order to do that, to add these files or these changes, I can just do git add and then -a. And now if I were to run git status again, you can see they're now in staging. And what's powerful about Git is the fact that I can come in and make a change to a file and it'll detect that change. You can see it's modified it. I'm going to go ahead and commit that to my main branch. I'll call it first commit. And so now you can see that there was some deletions because I deleted that YAML file. But those modifications, including the modification I'm interested in, which is the return statement, has been updated. So if I were to do git status, I'm in a clean tree. So great. So I'm in my main branch. I'm in the clean tree. Cool. So the code was updated. So this is good. We're about halfway there. So we've basically cloned a project from GitHub. We went over to Azure. We created our web application, which we're going to eventually deploy it to. And we also went back to our code locally. We made a change to it. And now we're ready to push that change up to our Azure DevOps Repository. So let's go ahead and grab that URL. And so we're going to use this, right? Push an existing repository from command line, because that's exactly what we have. And so I'm going to use these commands. And let's go ahead and begin. Let's go back to VS Code. So the first thing I want to do is show you this git remote -v. And notice whenever you do a clone from a different repository, it's going to maintain that origin URL. And so right now it's for fetching and pushing, it's going to that GitHub repository that I used originally to pull down that code. I want to change that, right? Because I want to push this code up to my Azure DevOps repository. So in order to do that, there's a command I can run for that. It is git remote set URL origin. And I'll paste in the path that I copied from the repository. I misspelled remote. Sorry about that. Okay, that's finished. And so now if I run git remote v, you can see that now I'm fetching and pushing to this new repository. So that's actually really important, is that if you're playing around and you're cloning from different repositories and then you want to make changes and then push that code to a different repository somewhere else, you'll need to know how to do this. And so now that that is set correctly, now I can actually go ahead and push my local branch containing my updated code change up to my Azure DevOps repository. So I will run git push u origin main. And main stands for main branch. Notice it's having me authenticate. And so I'm going to authenticate to my Azure DevOps repo, and notice it is being pushed up. So cool. So it's finished. Let's take a look. So remember when I said this wasn't initialized? Now that I've pushed my code to it, you can see it now has my code. And this is pretty cool, right? So we've almost come full circle. So now we have the code sitting on a repository. I'm just going to start saying repos. It's easier. But now we have that code sitting in a repo in my Azure DevOps project. So I do want to stress again, this is very high level. I do plan on getting more into the weeds in future videos on different things about Azure DevOps. Because there's a lot you can do with it, and let's move on. So next up, we're going to basically build and we're going to deploy this Python web application to Azure. And in order to do that, we're going to use pipelines to do that. And so I'm going to go to pipelines. I'm going to create a pipeline. This is a really easy way to do it because you can go through this wizard and it'll pre-populate what's called a YAML file. And I will do a video on deep diving a YAML file so you feel comfortable with those. But in any event, let's go ahead and fill this out. So where is our Azure repo, right? It's Git based and it's going to be in Azure. And notice it has my repo already present. It's already done some detection and determined that it was Python. It's a Python web application. And I want to deploy that to a Linux web application in Azure. So I'm going to select this second option. Notice on the right it pops up with my subscription information. So this Azure DevOps portal is tied into my subscription. And so I'm going to select that. I'm going to hit continue. And I need to authenticate into my Azure subscription. So I'll do that now. Okay, I just finished that. Cool. So now I get to select the web app. And so I'm going to choose that Azure web application that I provisioned earlier, which is RustMax 7. Now validate and configure. And this is going to automatically generate that YAML file I talked about. Could I do all these tasks manually within the YAML file? Yes, I can. Is this a lot easier? Absolutely. But it's important to note that I can make a lot of changes to this YAML file if I need to tweak it or add functionality to it. But essentially what this is going to do is it's going to build the web application. And you can see it's in stages. I'll talk about stages later on in a different video, but it's going to go through what's called a build stage. And it's going to build this project into an application, and it's then going to deploy that application to my Azure web app. So again, not going to get into too many details. The only thing I will talk about here is trigger. The trigger is a pretty important piece to an Azure pipeline. So if I make a change to the main branch, for example, I'm going to change that to main, right? Because it's my main branch. But anytime there's a change made to my repo in Azure, my DevOps repo, if there's a change made, like if I were to make a change locally and push that change, this trigger means that every time that change is pushed to my Azure DevOps repo, this pipeline is going to run. So that's where you get into those terms you might have heard before, like continuous integration, continuous deployment. Again, I'll dive into that like in future videos, but I do want to stress that the trigger main is important. So the end result here is when I click save and run on this file, it's going to put this pipeline, Azure Pipelines YAML, into my repo. I'll show you that. And I'm even going to rename it. So what's cool is you can rename this stuff. So I will call it ResMax-pipelines, okay? And what's going to happen is when I click save and run, it's basically going to kick off. And I can do a commit message. And notice, commit directly with the main branch. That's what I want to do. Save and run. And now you can see under pipelines, my pipeline is currently, it's about to be triggered, right? Right now it's not started, but what should happen is this pipeline will kick off. But let's go over to repos so I can show you that file is present. So notice my pipeline YAML is now there. So when I make a change to this code locally within VS Code, and then I go through the process using Git, and I push that into this branch, this is going to kick off that pipeline. Okay, so let's go back to pipelines. And notice it's still running here. Let's see. Still going. What's cool about these jobs are you can get some detail while it's running and see where you're at. So it looks like the build stage is completed successfully. It's just about done. And then the next step is obviously going to be to deploy that to my Azure web app. Ah, cool, it's finished. And one important thing is during the pipeline run, notice it creates this artifact. And that's actually, it packages the application into a zip file. And now it's deploying. Let's take a look. All right, great, it finished. Let's take a look. So green checks are good. If you do get errors, don't get discouraged. What I would recommend is to go ahead and look at details around that error and go use Bing and figure out why, or Google, and figure out if others have experienced those errors and keep at it. But in any event, it deployed successfully. So let's go to Azure and test this out and see if it actually works. So this is the original URL for this Azure web app. And what I expect to happen is when I hit refresh, it should actually show me the new page with the return statement that I had. And there it is. So cool. So hello, this code was updated locally and pushed to Azure DevOps Repo. So awesome. So we've come full circle. If you follow along, definitely recommend it. get your hands on this, get used to it. But essentially, this is going to take you through that whole process I mentioned, cloning that particular repository from GitHub or wherever you want, getting that local, make your code changes, pushing those code changes into an Azure DevOps repo, and then creating your pipeline. And I will go into more detail into future Azure DevOps sessions, and you'll see why Azure DevOps is such a great solution for managing code and ensuring that your development and project teams work together in a cohesive manner. Okay, that brings us to a close. Here are some resources, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.